I would just like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Jackie. I work in the Ann Arbor District Library events team. I'm very gratified to work with the Depression Center. This is multiple years in a row and lovely programming that you guys always put together. I appreciate everyone showing up for tonight's event. Right now, I'm going to introduce you to Lizelle from the Depression Center, who is going to give you a more thorough introduction of all of our guests.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Bright Nights. This is a program through the University of Michigan Eisenberg Family Depression Center in collaboration with the Ann Arbor District Library. A few notes before we get started. This will be a recorded event and will be available as a recording afterwards. And the first 30 minutes of the presentation will be from Dr. Martz, and the second half will be a panel Q&A featuring Dr. LaBelle and Matt Statman as well. So I would like to introduce our speaker, our main lead speaker for the event today. We have Dr. Meghan Martz. Dr. Meghan Martz is an assistant professor in psychiatry at the University of Michigan. She is a developmental psychologist using interdisciplinary research as a tool to better understand psychosocial and neural factors underlying substance misuse during adolescence and young adulthood. She is particularly interested in identifying aspects of resilience in addition to risk. Dr. Martz received her PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan, followed by a postdoctoral position at the Michigan Medicine Addiction Center. Prior to her doctoral work, Dr. Martz received her MSW degree from the University of Chicago and completed clinical internships in mental health in community and hospital settings. Her work has been funded by the National Institute of Health and has been published in journals such as JAMA, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and Psychological Medicine. So please welcome Dr. Martz.
Thank you so much for having me today. I was so excited to be invited to give this talk. In my world in research, we publish a lot in journals, but I've been really trying to reach out more to the community and do more community engagement. So this is a great opportunity to do that. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started on my talk on substance use in the brain, using neuroscience to understand pathways to addiction and also to inform treatment. Okay, so just to orient everyone to this talk. So first I'll be talking about substance use as a public health topic, and then get into early risk factors for substance use, and then effects of substance use on brain function. And so in those earlier sections of the talk, I'll be mentioning risk quite a bit. And so I also want to talk about, on the flip side of that, my work on resilience, in particular among youth with a family history of addiction that show low levels of substance use themselves. And then finally, I'll discuss some of my more recent work that's using real-time fMRI neurofeedback relevant to substance use and talk about some clinical implications of that as well. Okay. And so for this talk, I'm going to be mostly discussing alcohol, marijuana, which is also sometimes called cannabis, and then to a little bit lesser extent, nicotine. So there's a lot of other substances involved, but these are going to be the main focus of my talk because they're the most commonly used substances in the populations I study. So starting with alcohol, and so factors related to alcohol misuse account for the third leading preventable cause of death in the US, with the first being tobacco use and the second poor diet and physical activity. And there's approximately 14.5 million people ages 12 and older that meet criteria for alcohol use disorder in the US. And one form of drinking that we're particularly concerned about is binge drinking. And so this is usually defined as 4 or more drinks in a row or 5 or more drinks in a row, depending if you're a man or woman, in about a 2-hour time frame. And so I want to show this. This is what a standard drink is across different drink types. And so that's how we measure what a drink is. But as you'll notice, going out to a bar or restaurant or even at home, people often pour much larger than an actual drink. And so one drink is not always equal to one standard drink. And you can see that here through some of the examples, like a Long Island iced tea, or you think you're having a single beer, but it could be really high alcohol by volume. And, this wine glass that holds an entire bottle of wine, that is not one glass of wine. And then this boot that holds 40 ounces of beer. And then marijuana. So THC is the psychoactive compound in marijuana. You may have heard of CBD. That's in a lot of substances that are on the market right now, that's the non-psychoactive component in marijuana. And so this figure here shows the endocannabinoid system, which is throughout the entire body. I'll mostly be talking about effects of marijuana on the brain. But THC overactivates receptors, these endocannabinoid receptors that results in altered senses and changes in mood, impaired movement, difficulty thinking and problem solving, as well as impaired memory and learning. And it can have other health effects like hallucinations and paranoia, in particular for people that have a family history of schizophrenia. Breathing problems, there could be developmental harm to the fetus as well. And the amount of THC in marijuana has been increasing in recent years. So the marijuana people were using in the 1970s is not the same marijuana people are using now. So the THC level has been rising, which is a particular concern for researchers and clinicians. We see that there has been an uptick in the number of emergency room visits attributable to marijuana that does kind of move in parallel with these heightened rates of THC over time. And then nicotine. So this drug stimulates the adrenal glands, which in turn creates an influx of adrenaline in the body. And so this creates this stimulating experience of increased blood pressure, respiration, and heart rate. And so nicotine, whereas that's the addictive component in marijuana, these products typically have a host of other chemicals that cause health effects. And so this is data from Monitoring the Future, which is actually a study here at University of Michigan, but they collect data on individuals across the US, starting when they're in 8th grade. And so here we see rates of past month alcohol, marijuana, and nicotine use among 8th graders shown in blue, 10th graders shown in red, and 12th graders shown in green. And so you can see those rates steadily increase. And then once you get to early adulthood, which is shown here, so here we have 19 to 26 years of age. So that's typically when we see the peak rate of use across substances, especially for binge drinking, which usually peaks around ages 21 to 22. And I want to point out too, so the rates of marijuana use have actually exceeded the rates of cigarette use. Cigarette use has plummeted in recent years. Vaping is still relatively popular, but it's interesting in more recent years how much marijuana has increased in rates of use. Okay, so now I've given kind of a big picture on the rates of use and what these substances are. I want to talk about some work we've done on early factors related to substance use. So the average age of first use is about 16. And there are a lot of different reasons we see people report for using to fit in. So if you think of the classic peer pressure reason for teens in particular using, to feel good. So to get that high that's associated with these drugs, to feel better. So in some ways, self-medicating. So using this to help with your emotional state. And to do better, to help to performance enhancement, thinking of like Adderall. I won't talk about that today, but that is definitely, especially with adolescents and young adults, something that is fairly prevalent. And so this model of brain development is what we use a lot when we study risk-taking, reward-seeking behavior, and substance use. And so what you can see here is the line in the red. This represents the brain's reward system. And so this matures around age of like puberty. And that is much earlier than the brain's cognitive control system that's in more of the prefrontal area of the brain, shown by the blue line. And so this developmental mismatch in these systems is believed to lead to increased risk-taking behavior, such as substance use. You can't really put the brakes on those on the car, on those reward-driven impulses. And one way we study this, is through inhibitory control, which taps into those decision-making cognitive processes involved in response inhibition. And so this describes controlling a habitual response and suppressing attention. And this is important because it's necessary for self-control over impulsivity, emotions, as well as behaviors. How we measure this in my work that uses FMRI, so that's functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a non-invasive technology used to measure changes in blood flow associated with brain activity. It's basically a big magnet that measures brain activity. And we do this through what's called a go, no-go task. And so the go conditions here are the letters except X, and X is no-go. So while they're in the scanner, they have a button and they press the button, press it to M, press it to B, etc. But when they get to X, they're supposed to withhold their response. And I want to practice this with you all so you can kind of get a feel for this task. Okay, so if you're by a table or maybe on your leg or something, you can tap your finger. So get your finger ready, and then when you see any letter except X, tap your finger. When you see X, don't tap. So try to withhold your response. Okay, here we go. Okay, I don't know if you found that challenging, but it's pretty hard to do. I mean, no one's perfect at it, which is why we do this, because we can get that range of kind of where people fall. So it is a way to measure inhibitory control. So we think about that developmental mismatch model. So another way that we, in focusing on the reward is using a task to kind of tap into that system. And responding to rewards originates in a dopaminergic pathway, mostly so in the ventral tegmental area, which is shown in yellow, and the nucleus accumbens shown in purple here. And the nucleus accumbens is an area I'll be talking about later on in some of my research I've done. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is involved in feelings of pleasure, but also learning and mood. And so rewards, whether they be natural or any kind of reward, causes an influx in dopamine. But we know that drugs of abuse cause an additional surge. So it's that surge of dopamine that teaches the brain to seek drugs, perhaps at the expense of other healthier goals and activities. And so some people think that dopamine might be associated with liking, but it's actually wanting and craving rather than liking. And so it's that reinforcement aspect that plays into addiction vulnerability. So this is a task we use to measure reward responding in the brain. It's called the monetary incentive delay task. And so there are different conditions while the person's in the scanner. And again, they have a button to press. So they're told that they can lose, win, or there's no money at stake. Those are the conditions. And for the win and loss trials, there's a larger reward and a small reward. And so then once they have that cue, there's a brief pause, which is the anticipatory period, and then the target. So they have to respond once they see that figure, the black figure. If they're too slow or too fast, they don't win or they do lose. But if they hit just the right time, then they get that reward or they don't lose. So we're really interested in that anticipatory period. So kind of wanting that reward, and then how they respond once they receive the reward. So in one of the studies we did, this is from the Michigan Longitudinal Study, the MLS. So this is a study of over 2,200 individuals and 400 families from Southeast Michigan, that about 75% of these families have a parent that has an alcohol use disorder. And so this is a particularly vulnerable sample. And so this is a good sample to use to kind of understand the multi-level factors that contribute to risk outcomes. And so in a sample of the children in this study, we found that over and above externalizing behavior, which describes acting out more aggressive behavior than we know is linked to substance use risk, the greater activity in the nucleus accumbens during reward anticipation resulted in greater odds of early substance use initiation. So the implications being that this heightened reward responding could be an early indicator of substance use risk. And again, keep in mind, these individuals hadn't used it all. So there's something out of the brain that we could measure that could be a red flag for this substance use behavior later on. So there's some really interesting work being done by the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. I'm a part of this study. There's a site here at University of Michigan, and there's 21 sites across the country. So this study is following 11,000, which is a huge number, of 9 to 10-year-olds over 10 years, maybe even more. And it started out with a study. They wanted to try to get these kids before they start engaging in substance use behavior to kind of understand those earlier risk factors, and then once they start using, what are some outcomes? There's a lot of other things this study is looking at related to brain development, social functioning, mental and physical health. And they're in year 4 of data collection for this. And so we are starting to see some early substance use. Luckily, it's still a pretty small sample of individuals. So they're about 12 to 13 at this age. And we're finding that things we measured at baseline, specifically curiosity to use, perceiving that your friends are using, parents who haven't made rules yet about substances, and having that family history, which I'm showing here by FH positive. You'll see that a little bit later on, family history positive, were predictors of this earlier use. Okay, so now getting into not only what are the things that predict use, but what are outcomes of heavy use? So adolescents and young adults are typically less likely to experience some of the perceived consequences of substance use, especially the more immediate ones. For example, hangovers. And so because of this, it leads to greater consumption and also more damaging short and long-term neurotoxic effects. And going back to that figure, we know that brain development is still happening in these key areas, in decision-making areas, all the way up through the mid-20s. And so this heavier level of use is what's concerning. The figure on top here, you can see more of the short-term effects of heavy alcohol use on the brain. You might think, okay, alcohol affects the liver, but really it's more systemic than that. The level of the brain, it affects thought processes, judgment, concentration, mood changes, loss of memories, disrupted sleep. And then the figure below that shows over time what heavy alcohol use can do to the brain. So you can see on the right there, the shrinkage in the brain that has occurred. And marijuana also has an effect on the brain as well across different regions, including regions involved in senses and thinking, learning, motor control, anxiety and paranoia, and also increased appetite. And also the ventral striatum. So this is the euphoria, relaxation, also reward related region of the brain. And so since I'm interested in studying reward functioning and risk factors and also consequences of use, we focused in on this region, so the nucleus accumbens, and we wanted to test what kind of associations we saw between marijuana use over time through early adulthood and reward responding in that particular area of the brain. And what we found is that persistent marijuana use decreased the brain's natural response to reward. So they were doing this money task. It didn't have anything to do with the drugs. It was more of the brain's kind of baseline natural response to rewards. That was dampened in heavy marijuana users, with the implications that this dampened response to natural rewards might increase risk for addiction, because you might, if your response to rewards has been decreased, your baseline's lower, and so you might need to use substances to kind of get back up to that feeling, that rush that you are no longer able to get just naturally, endogenously from your brain. And one study I did here of a sample from the Michigan Longitudinal Study, I wanted to look at brain function associated with both impulse control and reward responding. So I looked at activation in both of these tasks for the individuals. And I wanted to see what kind of pattern of activation we saw and how that might be associated with substance use behavior. And so we measured cumulative marijuana, nicotine, and alcohol use leading up to their scan. So aspects of substance use earlier on that affected their brain function. And in this study, you can see that there are 4 groups that emerged when we looked at patterns of brain activation across the impulse control task shown on the left and the reward task shown on the right here on those figures. And we expected heightened reward in the higher substance using group, but we didn't necessarily expect that higher level of activation in cognitive control circuitry during this task. And we saw that across the groups, there were no significant differences in behavioral performance while they were doing the task. So like reaction time, for example. So that made us think, well, maybe this greater impulse control inhibitory activation in this higher level substance using group could be compensatory. In other words, maybe they're having to work harder to perform at the same level as the other groups. And this does support other work in our group that we have found that when we're just measuring their reaction time, we're seeing similarities, but when we look at brain function, we're seeing differences. And that also, I think, gives more value to the what brain imaging can show us, maybe some conscious or things that paper and pencil assessments can't do. Okay, so just to sum things up, we talked about before based on our research. So it appears that greater activation in these reward areas before individuals start using results in like kind of a greater risk that they're going to start using perhaps at an earlier age and also at a heavier level. And once individuals start using more heavily, then that dampens their natural response to rewards in their brain. Okay, so I talked a lot about a risk here, and I don't want to not talk about resilience, kind of in that bookmark of the 2 spectrums here. In particular with this group of individuals that have a family history of addiction. And so this stat here shows that more than 10% of US children 17 and younger live with a parent with alcohol use disorder. I believe this number is pretty similar to what we're seeing in the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, the ABC study as well. And there are a lot of different factors that contribute to risk in this group. First, genetics, which accounts to about 40 to 60% of risk for addiction, exposure to abuse, stress, and conflict, involvement with more deviant peers, exposure to substances, particularly in the home, which could lead to earlier use, less parental monitoring, and neural deficits in inhibition and reward responding, a lot of the work that we've shown. But we also know, so this is not from our work, I'll show you our work in a little bit, but this is another study of children who have a parent that has an alcohol use disorder. And I was looking at this and thought, I was actually pretty shocked that about 40% of these individuals show non-binge drinking alcohol behavior across adolescence and into early adulthood. So it made me wonder, what are the brain characteristics of resilience against substance use in this group that is kind of expected to go on to have problems just by looking at the statistics? So in this study, I took a group of individuals who all had that risk. They were all family history positive from this data set, but the resilient group were non-users versus the high-risk group who were early substance users. And so what I had them do is what's called a resting state scan. And so they were in this scanner and they were asked to lay as still as possible and just try to focus on this plus sign. So we're just trying to understand their brain connectivity while they're at rest. And we found that this resilient group had stronger synchrony between brain regions associated with self-control, including flexible adaptation of thoughts and behaviors. So that was between the left prefrontal cortex and the left posterior cingulate cortex. And so this could inform prevention intervention efforts because to think more about how we can boost self-control. So if we know the self-control might be elevated in this vulnerable group, perhaps when they're a little bit younger, we could focus on efforts promoting that boosting of self-control, especially in this group, in this risk group. So in another study I did, so this is actually part of my dissertation work done here at Michigan. Again, I had everyone in the group was family history positive, but I broke them out into resilient being low binge drinking and low marijuana users versus high risk, high binge drinking and heavy marijuana use. And that was looking at their trajectories of use across a span of ages through adolescence through early adulthood. And we also looked, the nice thing about this study is they've got great data early in childhood on these individuals. And so we can look at earlier factors affecting later outcomes. And so we found that at ages 12 and 14, so in childhood, the resilient group had greater behavioral control. They also had lower externalizing at ages 17 to 18. So that's that acting out behavior. And they had greater prefrontal activity involved in inhibitory control at age 20. And so these were all things we measured that were prior to those trajectories of substance use. And interestingly, we modeled all these things together. So even after accounting for these more psychosocial factors, the brain still held on as a significant predictor. And again, we're seeing here that greater self-control, both at the brain and behavioral level, could be an indicator of resilience. Okay, so that was work on a lot of other amazing existing data sets, but I wanted to think about some questions I could do with my own data, and I was able to get funding from the National Institutes of Health to do this real-time fMRI neurofeedback study that's relevant to substance use. And I want to talk a little bit about that work. So what is real-time fMRI neurofeedback? Kind of a mouthful. But if you think back to that, I told you a little bit very briefly about what fMRI is. So it's the same technology used for that, but you isolate a particular region of the brain or circuitry within the brain, and you attach that activity to some kind of feedback indicator, a dynamic display. For example, a lot of people use like a thermometer that goes up and down. And so just by using your thoughts, you can change that thermometer. So you can make the thermometer go up or down by the strategies or thoughts you're trained on when you go in the scanner. So there's no button press in this task, just your thoughts that we're measuring. And so this has been used clinically in a lot of different ways, different treatment targets, including substance use disorder. I did a review paper a few years ago on looking at real-time fMRI specifically applied to substance use. And most of these studies, so they train individuals to respond to cues, usually substance-related cues, prior to the scan, and then they're instructed to up or down regulate brain activity or connectivity. They do the scan session, and then they measure them after the scan session to see if that practice in cognitive training, the brain training, resulted in maybe decreased cravings or different use behavior. Some studies even follow them up over time too. So some example findings from this work was that there was reduced alcohol craving related brain activity that they found even after a single session, and reduced this, so neurofeedback reduced both nicotine craving related brain activation, and then also the responses that people reported after they got out of the scanner in terms of their experiences of craving. And so my study is more of a, we call like basic science approach. So I want to just use this, it's been used in clinical ways, but to step back a little bit and think about how we can use this modality to better understand both impulse control and reward responding, the cognitive control and reward functioning more dynamically. And also these developmental and sex differences we see in reward-related self-regulation. And in some ways it taps into self-efficacy of linking thoughts and brain function too, which relates to things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which really a big core of that treatment is kind of showing people like your thoughts can change your experiences and your feelings. And so we're showing we can do this with their brain function as well. So I've got two groups, one group of adolescents and one young adults. And they are given explicit strategies to increase their reward activity. which is shown here. So they see this blue ball in the scanner, and we say, when you see the blue ball, use your strategy. So think of rewarding things. It doesn't matter what it is. We just want to show that they can have self-control over reward responding. So things they're excited about coming up in the future, food they like to eat, whatever it is. So they do that, and then they try to get that red ball, and they can get that to move just by thinking of rewarding things. And then another condition is when they see the yellow ball. If you notice, these are Michigan colors. The yellow ball, they are asked to decrease their reward activity. And so I also want to point out that these are healthy individuals that are low substance users, because since it's such a novel modality, and there's only one other study that's looked at real-time fMRI in the nucleus accumbens in that key reward region, I wanted to first just start out and understand the process. Can people do this? And do we see that, like young adults, which my hypothesis is that the young adults are going to be better able to do that because they do have stronger self-control related to that kind of developmental mismatch model. And then my goal is to hopefully get another grant where I can use this same paradigm in substance using populations to see if people, if by boosting their self-regulation and self-control through this, that could result in more like kind of a harm reduction approach to thinking that they can have like a better control over their reward responding. Okay, so some initial findings showing from this study is that the task does appear to elicit activation in the nucleus accumbens, which is where the dark red is. That's where we would expect it to be. And excitingly, we're seeing other activation too. So if we're targeting one region, we expect there's other regions recruited to cause change in that region. And so that's a key aspect of what we're studying. And so in preliminary work we did looking at this connectivity, we found that there was greater involvement in the right cingulate cortex, which is involved in processing reward-related information, connected to nucleus accumbens activity that showed specific feedback-related involvement. And so if we are still recruiting individuals for this study, and so if you hold your phone up, if you get the camera out, or if you have a QR reader and scan this, you can access our study website, or you can email me as well. So again, this is 14 to 16-year-olds. So if you know anyone 14 to 16 who might be interested, or 25 to 27-year-olds. And so they can find out more information about the study, or you can email us if you have any interest too. It is a paid study. The teenagers get $175 and the young adults get $75. But more excitingly than the money even, people are most excited to see a picture of their brain. That is the big draw. So you get to see a picture of your brain and take it home with you after the scan, which is pretty fun. So that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much. I know I presented a lot of information, and hopefully we can dive into a few more details in the Q&A with the other the fabulous panel that we have lined up. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions. And I want to acknowledge my funding support from the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, the Addiction Center, Catalyst Award, the fMRI Lab, and our study team, and my K1 mentors, and also the people that have volunteered for our studies as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martz. I mean, I would love to see my brain myself. It seems like such a cool opportunity. So thank you for sharing that as well. If you have any questions for Dr. Martz, and then our other panelists, Dr. LaBelle and Matt Setman, please enter them into the chat. I'm just going to give some brief introductions of both of our other expert panelists, and then I will open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, again, just please send them over in the chat and direct message to me. So we are very fortunate to have these panelists here today to share their clinical expertise as well. So first we have Dr. Anawa Labelle, who is an assistant professor at the University of Windsor. And collaborating scientist at Homewood Research Institute. She earned a PhD and MS from the University of Michigan and a BA from Smith College, all in psychology. In addition to her formal education, Dr. Labelle gained advanced training at Harvard University, Mount Holyoke College, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and the University of Massachusetts. In her scholarly work, Dr. Labelle draws heavily upon positive psychology to study recovery from alcohol and substance use disorder. Her recent work includes examination of online recovery meetings during COVID-19, women's relationship experiences in recovery, and a Buddhist-based approach to recovery. Dr. Labelle regularly lectures on topics related to recovery, adult attachment, intimate relationships, and the health and wellness benefits of gratitude. We also have today Matt Statman. Matt is a manager at the University of Michigan Collegiate Recovery Program, part-time lecturer at the Eastern Michigan University School of Social Work, private social work practitioner, and member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. He has spent his career helping people who have substance use disorders and has worked in a variety of settings. He has been a lecturer at Eastern Michigan University since 2013 and has managed a recovery support program at the University of Michigan since 2012. Thank you all for our clinical experts for joining us. And we do have a few questions in the chat. So I will start off with our first question, and this goes out to Dr. Martz more specifically, but if any of the other panelists would like to chime in, please do so afterwards. So this question is, can we please discuss what fMRI is in detail? I have been a healthcare worker for over 8 years and I haven't learned about this technology yet.
How long do we have? Yeah, well, I didn't get into it too much, but I will direct you, and I can put it in the chat here. There's some really great online resources. So Coursera is a free training. They have a free training website. They have also sort of courses on there. So the University of Michigan also has prior lectures and PowerPoints on their fMRI training course. So I will share those in the chat because that would probably be the best way to kind of, you can skip through ahead to things because there's a lot of physics involved. Yeah, there's this, like, it could be a whole nother hour or two to talk about it. So I will definitely add those resources in there for people to, if they want to dive a little bit more into the technology behind fMRI.
Do any of the other panelists have any other comments on that, or would you like to answer? Okay. So this is another question that we have. They said that I am a psychotherapist in the community. Can someone please summarize the information that you have learned from your studies that can help us in working with teens who are growing up in FH+ families?
I don't know if Matt, if you, as a clinician, if you know, have experience with that?
So I don't do a lot of prevention work. So I'm not an expert in that area. I would, yeah, I would not want to comment on that. I work with people who have more severe substance use disorders and are in recovery from more severe substance use disorders.
Yeah, I will say that on some of my work on resilience, that I've had discussions with colleagues about they're doing better than the high risk group, but they're still maybe not doing as well as people that don't have a family history of substance use disorder. So, I think that there's social support is key. Usually having other adults who are someone that they can look up to, that aren't struggling with addiction. And the scary thing is too, sometimes it can, like skip a generation too, where maybe like the parent, like the grandparent had a problem, and then because that child like saw how awful it was for their living like that they didn't have a problem, but then that genetic vulnerability is still there, and so then maybe the child has a problem. And so the intergenerational transmission is something to be aware of, and a lot of families hide that. There's unfortunately a lot of stigma still attached to it, but it's very multidimensional. Like I said, there's peer factors, the mental health, the psychology, the experience of trauma, the work we're doing. So individuals that have a family history of substance use disorder are disproportionately high in adverse childhood experiences as well. So it's very complex. And I think, and everyone has a different experience with it too. What I've seen in the ABCD study, interestingly, when we're looking at very early substance use and like exposure to substances, like having rules about substance use, we found that the individuals, like the parents, and we don't know which parent reported it, if it was the parent with the problem or not, but the access to substances was a lot lower in those parents than individuals that didn't have that family history. And we don't know if maybe that's kind of a protective strategy that, and maybe it's easier when the kids are 9 and 10 that they can, try to hide it a little bit better. And it's a developmental problem too. I think, there are differences, different risk factors at different ages. And it's very multidimensional. So, but I think just awareness, like being aware that you have that vulnerability, but you have some control over that too, which is some of the work we're showing, that, you're not just destined, you have this, you might be at risk, but here's some things you can do, to focus on self-control, for example, like to just kind of be more aware of that. And if that's helpful at all.
I think the other thing that I would add to that is just making sure that communication is open and that it's conveyed sort of where the warning signs are, what the red flags are, right? Because I feel like, especially in youth, and then talking about entering college and university, it's normalized, right? Excessive drinking. And often people that have a predisposition or who may be prone to alcoholism or just using it to self-medicate, it's normalized to an extent that when they get to the end of their university career, other people sort of taper off or they slow down, but they can't. And because there's such stigma associated with it, and there's this idea of what someone with alcoholism or alcohol use disorder looks like, they don't recognize it in themselves or in their friends. And so I think just having conversations about what that looks like and the warning signs would be also super helpful.
And there are, I would note too, that there's plenty of individuals that don't have any family history of addiction that go on to experience addiction themselves as well too. It's not like, any kind of moral failing. And, our work by Nora Volkow, who's the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, they're really adamant that it's a brain disease. And so that's kind of their stance on addiction. And that there's a lot of factors that play into whether people are going to have a problem or not. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic background is. It can affect anybody. And we are finding actually that rates of use are becoming much more similar with girls and boys. So we're not seeing as much of a gender difference in substance use, which is problematic because women metabolize alcohol differently. And so they're usually more vulnerable to the neurotoxic effects of alcohol. and other health effects disproportionately compared to men. And there's also, more women entering the workforce, and kind of this view of, when you become a mom, then you drink to cope with the stress, or that's another thing too. I think the gender difference is something we're seeing as well.
Thank you. We have another question. This is kind of a more general question, but what trends have you all seen in substance use and misuse from the pandemic?
I can talk a little bit anecdotally about the college population that I'm working with. And in fact, we've seen mental health problems worsen in that population. And we've seen some evidence that substance use declined during the pandemic. There may also be a rebound effect now that people are able to go out again and socialize. And that's sort of general and anecdotal. It's also my experience that young people who already were experiencing substance use disorders may have used more during the pandemic. But none of that is, based on research. It's just kind of what we're seeing. Certainly for a lot of people, staying in recovery was made more difficult during the pandemic because access to social support changed. And Anna's research on sort of how people are using online recovery support is going to be really interesting to check out. But I've also talked to young people who got into recovery during the pandemic. And now that the world is opening up again, they're struggling with integrating into sort of a more social setting with their recovery. So it's affected a lot of people in a lot of different ways.
I just added to the chat some recent news from the Monitoring the Future study that tracks substance use behavior, and they have found in teens that use has gone down quite a bit, which isn't too surprising if you think about the social aspect of substance use, especially at that in adolescent ages. In the ABC study, I was just looking at some preliminary data on motives for use, and we saw just anecdotally just there seemed to be a lot more emotion related use, like instead of the pure related factors contributing to use. But I think the rebound effect is interesting, and we'll see how things change over time as society opens up a little bit more.
And that's young people. There was recently some stuff that came out this week about how alcohol-related death increased by a lot in our country. So when you look at the whole picture, that the reductions in use may or may not be true for the whole population.
Yeah, I think, it's definitely just teenagers where I think they're seeing that. I think other rates have gone up in adult populations. I feel like I read somewhere that opioid misuse increased during the pandemic as well. But I believe alcohol definitely did.
All right, well, thank you all for answering that question. This is a follow-up question for Dr. Martz. So when you said that women metabolize alcohol differently, can you please elaborate on the metabolism differences between males and females?
Yeah, I can't talk too much on this because it's not really my area of expertise. But yeah, and again, I can add some resources in the chat. But it has couple things I do know. So part of it is related to the fat distribution of women compared to men, and in the way that they metabolize alcohol. And so let's see. And then also, oh gosh, I was blanking on the other one. But yeah, it's predominantly related. Oh yes, I was going to add this, that actually in my study on reward functioning, one of the reviewers asked if I'm asking, and we're in like the menstrual cycle, the women are in my study since I'm looking at sex differences. And I was a little bit confused by that. And I dove into the research a bit more on that. And where a woman is at in their menstrual cycle can affect their reward responding and their experience of intoxication as well to substances. And so the week before your period, you can get more intoxicated. It's fascinating. I don't know like too much of the science behind it, but that was one of the points in the talk, is that even like where a woman is at in their menstrual cycle can have an impact on their response to the perceptions of intoxication. But yeah, I can, and Dr. Ann Fernandez is doing some interesting work on sex differences in alcohol use in the department, and Jillian Hardy as well. So yeah, I'll see if I can find something quickly to add on more like the metabolism, if I can get that information.
Thank you. And then Dr. LaBelle, I don't know if you wanted to follow up, since I know that you do some work with just women in recovery, and if you wanted to comment on that, how maybe there's any differences between sexes there.
Well, I can't speak to metabolizing alcohol. I did just put a link in of a site that I've relied upon for information about that specifically, which is, I think is interesting. But in terms of recovery, I mean, there's a disproportionate amount of men who are in recovery spaces versus women, at least in, you know, the gold standard for peer support, which is 12-step fellowships, the most referred and widespread use. But we're seeing a lot of alternative pathways, which is one of the things that I'm really interested in and excited about. So the Buddhist recovery pathways, also gender specific pathways, organizations like She Recovers are sort of paving the way and creating spaces for women who may have had more trauma related to their alcohol drinking, more you know, drinking to cover up emotions, as well as, you know, all the other reasons that have to do with that trauma. So really creating safe spaces for women to be in community and get the support that they need. And they're working pretty well, right? So it's exciting to me, right? 10, 15 years ago, there weren't these sorts of alternative supports. And one of the promising things that I found in the Buddhist study particularly is that there was a much higher proportion of LGBTQ individuals. So about 25% of the sample that of people that I surveyed identified as LGBTQ. And then there was a higher proportion of women. And so, you know, what that says is, if for some reason they're drawn to the Buddhist pathway, or maybe there are people that participate in 12-step as well, or but it's just encouraging that there are spaces that are becoming more proportionate for males versus females, and then the female specific spaces, which are, you know, becoming more common.
Thank you. And then a question came up regarding the information you just shared. They are asking, can you please name the other pathways for women's recovery other than She Recovers? Well,
generally speaking, there's Smart Recovery, there's Wellbriety, which is an indigenous focused 12-step spinoff, Red Road to Recovery. There's also, I don't want to say moderation maintenance, but there is Life Ring. Matt, help me out here. There's quite a few others that have started. She Recovers is more of a support network. There isn't a specific program, but a lot of people seem to really do well with social support in and out of that program. And I've done some work and research in that space as well. Not published yet, but soon, hopefully. Matt, do you have any to add to that?
I mean, in terms of gender specific, no, but there are lots of subgroups in all of those different mutual aid groups where people from minoritized genders kind of create their own groups so that they can meet with each other, including 12-step.
There is a group called Women for Sobriety as well. It's another organization.
In Ann Arbor, there's an Ann Arbor women's group, which is, I think, predominantly 12-step people, but it's a separate nonprofit and it's a women's group.
Thank you both for sharing those resources. I think it's really helpful that we're sharing that research, but also resources that people can go to as well. And then, so this question goes to Dr. Martz, and then they are asking if you can please summarize in layman's terms, what is the effect of adolescent substance abuse on the brain, and is it different than the effect on adult brains?
Yeah, well, I think based off of our research, we've focused on the inhibitory control and reward for reason, because that's where we typically see the biggest effects of like heavier substance use on functioning in those regions of the brain. And so in particular, that the heightened responding or like sensitivity to reward earlier on, and then where we see that flip, that's really concerning, where they're showing a higher level of reward responsivity before they start using, and then once they start using, then it decreases once they've started. And so that's where that, I was talking about kind of lowering the baseline of your body's natural way of creating rewarding experiences. And so by kind of lowering that baseline, that's a concern of ours, because then that's where I think vulnerability to addiction might come in. If you have to use substances to kind of get back to that, that feeling of like that natural high is no longer there. You have to use other substances to get that. There's a lot of other work too that we haven't, like not in our lab, but looking at more of the specifically like neurotoxic and like structural effects on the brain as well. And it seems to be just in general, heavier use and the earlier use is most problematic. We typically define early use as before age 14 or before age 16 as well, since that's typically the average age of use. And I didn't talk at all about like mixing substances too. So there's thoughts that sometimes maybe like mixing substances might make it more harmful as well. Like for example, if you add some work I've done on alcohol mixed with energy drinks, it can, by adding the caffeine, you don't feel as high. And so you might feel like, oh, I can, drive a car or do other things that, but actually your level of intoxication is the same as if you hadn't used. So yeah, so I think like mixing drinks, like the amount you're using, and I think a lot of young people just don't know how their body reacts to, and so they don't really know like their limits, of when they are feeling intoxicated and going from that fun experience to ending up having, like overdosing or having too much that leads to the health effects that we see.
And this is a follow-up question, Dr. Martz. Once those changes happen, is it permanent or can it be reversed?
The good thing is that we see that there can be reversal of those effects. I was just reading recently an article showing that they did track individuals, and when they were sustained abstinence, they were able to kind of perform and get the brain function back to where it was when they were not using heavily. So I think there is hope of, it may not be permanent, but the problem is, I think there's still so many other risk factors associated with like that heavier use. So even though you might be able to rebound in some ways, there might be other things that like you can't take back, of other kind of, if you get in a car accident or if you engage in like a high risk sexual behavior that was related to being intoxicated or that kind of thing. So, but yeah, typically they're seeing that the brain effects can be diminished over time with abstinence.
Thank you. Here's another question that we have. They're saying, I'm curious if there's much research being done about risk factors for substance abuse amongst people with ADHD, or if the clinicians can talk about how this may be a different challenge for people in recovery.
So I can't speak to the research, although there are a lot of people in recovery from substance use disorders who also have ADHD. And I think, one of the things that I'm very cognizant of and that I talk to people in recovery about is that the stimulant medications that are often the first line of treatment for attention issues can also be very destabilizing for recovery, whether or not the person had a stimulant use disorder before they got into recovery. Example, I was working with a guy who was in recovery from alcohol use disorder. He had a really severe problem with alcohol. He had never really used stimulants or other drugs at all. And he was in recovery for over a year. He then at some point was diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed a stimulant. And he said he started taking it. He felt more focused. He felt like it worked. Within a week, he thought, I got a lot of work to do tonight. Maybe I'll take 2. Within a couple of weeks, he was taking the whole bottle. Within a month, he was drinking again. And shortly after that, he was in the hospital with DTs. And that's not an atypical story. So people in recovery need to be really careful about how they treat their other co-occurring conditions and seek help from physicians who are knowledgeable about addiction and recovery.
So just inherently in ADHD, those individuals typically tend to be more impulsive, and we know that is, a risk factor for substance use, and so they might be a little bit more sensitive, like more drawn to drugs, and then also more sensitive to drugs, so they could maybe feel those the high, those rewarding effects of drugs more intensely. But it's really common in our sample, the Michigan Longitudinal Study, that there's a disproportionately high number of individuals with ADHD. There's a whole issue of diagnosing and how that plays into it as well. But yeah, typically there is an association between having ADHD diagnosis and being at higher risk for substance use.
So here's another question that we got from the audience. Their question is, if you start binge drinking as an adult rather than in adolescence, it typically isn't as addicting on the parts of the brain, or can it in a way catch up to the same level as if starting in adolescence? So I think they're kind of getting on the fact of what's the difference between binge drinking as an adult and binge drinking in adolescence.
So I think it's a good idea to delay the onset of the first use, and that will maybe lessen the likelihood for some people that they will develop a more severe problem, but it's not a guarantee at all. Certain people are just predisposed to having alcoholism or addiction, and if they start, it doesn't matter when they start drinking, it will progress over time. It will get worse. They will lose control over how much they're drinking, and it'll cause them a lot of negative consequences. And that's just some people. But obviously, or maybe not obviously, if kids are doing it, they're definitely more likely to end up with a more severe problem than if they wait until they're in their late teens or early 20s to start drinking more.
I've actually done some work on this, looking at different trajectories of use patterns. And so we see that like the early onset group is typically has the most amount of problems. So we're starting earlier. But I actually focus on that, what we call like late onset substance abuse. So you could think about maybe someone who is like, low substance user in high school, and they did all the, they were just like busy and not really associating with like, substance users, and they get to college, for example, and that kind of sets off a pattern of use that, some individuals aren't able to desist over time. They're not able, like maybe it continues that use even after they leave. And so, yeah, like Matt said, I would say it's probably worse if you start earlier, more severe effects, but there are still severe effects if you start later in adulthood as well. We know actually that binge drinking is fairly common in older adults too. It's not just a teenage problem. And then there's a concern there, again, with metabolizing as an older adult. And then a lot of older adults are on medications as well. So it's definitely not just like a teenage problem.
And if you walk through around the football stadium on a Saturday, you'll notice that. You'll see a lot of people my age binge drinking.
And binge drinking has actually been going down in recent years. And we're seeing marijuana go up a little bit at the population level. So it seems like maybe in this new generation, it's not, it's still happening, but it's not as common as it used to be. Maybe all those older people now, it was really common, when they were younger. So we are seeing some generational shifts as well.
Thank you. And then this is another question that we got. Has the likelihood for diagnosis of substance use disorder to skip generations been demonstrated equally amongst the different substances that you studied, Dr. Martz?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In our study, it's mostly alcohol use disorder, so we just don't really have the numbers to look at that. But that would be really interesting to look at in the ADHD study, where we might have the numbers, and they do specify in that study which relative it was. So we could look at that. So that's interesting. So yeah, we do know that for alcohol, but I would think it would probably be across different substance types. I think the brain is fairly agnostic in terms of, it's still across different types of drugs, it's still eliciting that dopamine influx. So I think in that sense, it may not necessarily matter the type of substance used as much.
I wonder, if Matt or Dr. LaBelle could just comment anecdotally, or if there's any patterns of experiences from clinicians on this topic.
I mean, it's definitely, you see it in families. I also see recovery in families. So I have many young people who have parents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles in recovery, and that is also, that normalizes, getting better, and I think is helpful for them to have seen. But I'm not sure about sort of the generational stuff.
I don't have anything to add to that. That's not my area of study. So I'll leave it to Matt and Megan to answer that question.
Thank you for adding what you can. So we have another question, and their question is, are there concerns for the replacement of alcohol with marijuana in these populations, or for the general population as well? People say how CBD can heal, although can the effects of replacing, People say how CBD can heal, although can the effects of replacing with marijuana use severely hinder recovery with addiction like alcohol?
So a little bit complicated. Generally speaking, for people who have more severe substance use disorders, so CBD aside, that's a whole nother issue. It's not a mood altering substance. It's risky to try to buy CBD from sources that are not, really reliable, because you never know what you're going to get in it, and there could be some THC in there, which would be not great for someone in recovery. Generally speaking, people who have more severe substance use disorders and identify as being in recovery, it is safest for them to abstain from all substances rather than try to do one substance and not do other substances. That is not the case with people who have more mild substance use disorders necessarily. And so it's important to make that distinction. In a college population where I'm working, we have a lot of people, we have a whole spectrum of substance use and non-use. We have a lot of people who don't use substances for personal reasons or religious reasons. They never had a problem. They just don't want to. We have most students, when they do use alcohol or cannabis, use it in a way that doesn't cause them a lot of problems. Many students experience some problems related to their substance use, and then are able to change their substance use to avoid negative consequences. And then you have some who start to experience negative consequences over and over again. And with a little bit of like brief intervention, they can change their trajectory. They just need some strategies and some coping skills. And then you have a group of people who have more severe problems, addiction issues. And for them, abstinence is probably the safest bet. They need to, they can use the social support that is the recovering community. And it's pretty risky to try, smoking pot, but not drinking for someone who had a severe alcohol use disorder. But there are exceptions to every rule there.
Yeah, and cannabis use disorder is an actual disorder as well. About the last stats I've seen, about 9% of individuals who use marijuana meet criteria for cannabis use disorder. But also no one's died directly as a result of marijuana use, and you can't say that for other drugs. But I think, like I talked about, the biggest concern with marijuana is just like the level of THC and like the cannabis concentrates and edibles. So the edibles take longer to get that high, and so you may not feel anything, and so you take more and more of them, and then it hits you all at once, for example. So I think there's still a lot of unknowns about route of administration and marijuana and how much people can have like in a safe way. And then there's the whole issue of driving after having marijuana. I feel like it's not as, cut and dry as with alcohol.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up the cannabis use disorder, because there's a lot of misinformation around that, especially in the population I work with. And there are definitely people who have really unhealthy relationships with cannabis, where their lives are completely unmanageable as a result of their cannabis use, and they cannot, without a lot of help, change that relationship, despite really being motivated to. And I see that regularly in the college population. I see that with some regularity. We have on campus, the primary substances that people run into problems with are alcohol and pot.
Thank you for commenting on that. And related, we just had a question that came in. Can you speak to any research on the impact of early onset marijuana use?
We don't really have the numbers to look at that in the Michigan Longitudinal Study, but we can start looking at that in the ABC study. We don't really have the numbers to start looking at like predictors of that, and then also another issue is that younger individuals kind of try everything. It's not like they're necessarily like choosing their drug, and so what I've seen with the early users and like the Michigan Longitudinal Study, they're not just typically using one thing, they're like dabbling in a lot of different things. So you'd have to account for possible effects from other substances as well, unless they're truly just using marijuana. And that might be the case because of, these edibles and vaping too, where it can be like a lot more accessible, especially, the way things are kind of moving in terms of different state level legislation. And but yeah, we don't know too much about, just because it is kind of a new thing. But I'm pretty sure the ABC study data will start looking at that. And they've been pretty good about giving information out to the public. I'll add there, I know we have like a whole list of resources here, but but yeah, if you check out the ABC study website, I believe they have information for parents and families and some of the newest findings coming out of that study. But because pretty much any information you want to know related to adolescent substance use is going to come from that study. They're going to have a lot of great data coming out of that.
Thank you. That's good to know. And I believe Dr. Martz is going to share that. No, right there in the chat. So this is the last question that I have, but if you have any last questions that come up, please send them in the chat. But the last question that I've received is, Dr. LaBelle, I see you've done work in positive psychology and with gratitude. How have you seen these things influence recovery?
It has a positive impact on recovery for sure. It's not mentioned in any of the 12-step work, and the work that I've done specifically has looked at it in 12-step populations. But in my dissertation, I looked at how gratitude and prosocial behavior are related. So one sort of is a result of the other, and it's just sort of cyclical. So I help someone, and then they're grateful for that help, and then they help someone. And so what I found in my dissertation work is that when people are helping and when they're more grateful specifically, they think about themselves less. And one of the trademark characteristics of people who have alcohol, substance use disorders, they tend to be very self-focused, especially like in the beginning. And so practicing gratitude and setting aside your own cares and concerns and instead focusing on helping someone else is sort of negates the helps a person feel better and move forward in their recovery.
I don't know if any of you, Dr. Martz or Matt, want to comment on that as well, if you've seen that at all.
I mean, people who hate their life are probably not going to stay sober. So gratitude for recovery is important. You know, I mean, if people got into recovery and then remained miserable, that wouldn't be tenable for very long. And so a lot of people, part of what their recovery practice is getting in touch with gratitude. And Anua, when Anua was at U of M, we did some work with the students in recovery we did some gratitude activities, which everybody found really helpful.
Yeah, gratitude is intriguing to me because it's one of those things that just seems to be related to so many other. I mean, it has such an impact and is correlated and influences so many things that I almost literally just always put it by default into studies when I'm collecting data. It's one of my primary interests, and so there's trickle-down effect for sure, and a lot of positive outcomes with regard to health and linked to spirituality and mental health outcomes. And the gratitude interventions that Matt was talking about was writing a letter to someone who's done something nice for you, and then, you know, your choice whether or not you deliver it. But that was one of many that we went over when I was presenting to the students there. But there's a lot of different ways. If you just Google gratitude interventions or practice, you will be amazed by how many there are, and that's because it is so effective for a lot of people.
So speaking of that, so the library did do an educational series on gratitude. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to a recorded video of a past community education event on why gratitude isn't just for Thanksgiving. So if you are interested in gratitude and would like to learn more, then you are more than welcome to watch that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that is it for our questions for today. So I just want to thank Dr. Martz, Dr. LaBelle, and Matt Statman providing their clinical expertise. This was a really educational event, and I'm so happy with all the resources that you provided in the chat as well. That is so helpful. And I also just want to thank the Ann Arbor District Library for hosting this and hosting events just like this. And then there are people who are saying thank you in the chat, but the default is that it's going to me. So I just want you to know that the audience also thanks you.